This is the Kratom Science Journal Club with Dr. Jonathan Cachat, neuroscientist and expert in psychopharmacology. In each episode, we discuss an article in a peer-reviewed journal. I'm your host, Brian Gallagher, blog and social media writer for KratomScience.com, your source for all things Kratom. This is a paper from the Journal of Psychopharmacology, published on November 11th, 2020. It's Ari Brouwer and Robin Lester Carhart-Harris. It's called Pivotal Mental States.
And I think we should probably just talk a little bit of like how we got here, because it's not Kratom related, but we just thought it was cool. And overall, my reaction at first was holy shit, this is way more philosophical and like structural, theoretical than what I thought would be in the Journal of Psychopharmacology. I didn't mind that. I just wasn't expecting it.
Yeah. I found it pretty. I mean, I printed it out and realized it was a 20-page paper, but I found it pretty easy to read with my non-science background. So it was kind of narrative in a sense. So I think a lot of people should read it because it's pretty concisely written. It'd be easy for the layman to read if you don't have a psychopharmacology background.
Yeah, you're right. There's only the only mention of sort of receptors and signaling is the serotonin subtype receptors, so either 2 or 1 or 1A, but that's about as technical as it got in terms of the the neuroscience of it. But I think it also is applicable to the audience in a broader way, in that really what they're trying to discern between, or sort of figure out if they can guide people into this sort of elevated stress state where they're able to like integrate and learn or see things in a new way, such that their behavior changes afterwards. And that's sort of, that's my like paraphrase definition of the pivotal mental state. My favorite one was the one that they used on page 8. This paper presents an extension to highlight how chronic stress primes the serotonin system for the elicitation of a pivotal mental state, a hyperplastic state in which prior assumptions are relaxed, enabling enhanced sensitivity to potential new information consistent with rapid and deep learning. And then the whole paper sort of just tracks that trajectory from the cellular receptors up through the psychology and even the social structures that they're related to.
People listening to this can think of a pivotal mental state as stress leads to it, and then it's kind of like, I guess like a spiritual term would be epiphany, but they point out throughout the paper that it's not necessarily a positive. Leads to positive results. It could be a state of stress, like if you were in solitary confinement and then you had a psychotic episode. But also it might be sort of an epiphany type of mental state that leads to insights and whatnot. And then they talk about how psychedelics might be able to create this without the type of stressors and they talk about various stressors that might create this mental state, like sleep deprivation, starvation. They even said forced swimming, the one which I was just looking at that now before we started, and I was like, I gotta read into that one, because I guess like somebody downs a ship and says you gotta swim the rest of the way in a war situation. I don't know. That would certainly create a pivotal mental state, or some kind of mental state.
Yeah. I think it's good that you brought up that it's not neither positive nor negative. Essentially, it's a period in which you seem to have elevated cortical plasticity, so the ability to make new connections, enhanced rate of associative learning, and then the elevated capacity to mediate psychological transformations. And so the way that they frame this was kind of interesting to me, in that they're saying that this is probably an evolutionary adaptation in order to sort of lead to rapid changes before something just goes completely awry. And so I think it's almost easier because they use the psychedelics and they use religion or spirituality as a way to discuss sort of a positive movement. That's an outcome. But then I think the sort of more clear example is PTSD. And so you think about you're in a heightened situation in which there's a lot of emotional value tied and associated with whatever you witness or are seeing. And because of that, it's imprinted. It's a stronger memory. And so they say it can go both ways, and there's no real way to control it unless you have all of the context included, and there's a lot of background work, which is eventually where they're trying to go. But for them, I think it was more about not the outcomes of it, but just trying to get to that state, and then supporting sort of more supportive contexts and environments that can take advantage of that mental state and use it for good rather than using it for bad.
It says a consistent root state can mediate strongly divergent outcomes such as spiritual or religious epiphany or conversion versus the acquisition of a psychotic delusion. In this paper, we use a recent definition of stress as the body's multi-system response to any challenge that overwhelms or is judged likely to overwhelm selected homeostatic response mechanisms. And so they discuss different stressors, and it says if a PIMS is not expected and the experience is protracted, then the net effect of this is likely to be distressing. Versus if you're a monk and you fast on purpose, or you sleep deprive yourself on purpose, versus being placed in solitary confinement against your will.
Right.
The on purpose religious type of stuff is likely to lead to a better outcome than forced stressors. They talk about cognitive stress, social stress, and physiological stress, and how this all relates to the 5-HT2AR, which is serotonin receptor.
They're trying to construct a valuable framework in which to understand behavior or consciousness, if you will. And it starts out citing a 1977 paper that was basically calling for a biopsychosocial approach to medicine.
And this kind of relates to your undergrad thesis, is it?
Right. Yeah. So in undergrad, I designed my own Bachelor of Science degree, and it was called Social Neuroscience. And anyway, the point being, just like this biopsychosocial approach to illness or diagnosing any other ailments or abnormalities in humans, is that those things are all intrinsically related and connected. There's no distinction between them. But if you look at the academic disciplines, there are distinctions between them. And so it leads to this disconnection, especially of the social sciences and the natural sciences. But the point being is that they're making a plea to modern medicine to essentially say the biophysiological mechanics of the human body are not the only or the primary sometimes cause of any illnesses or abnormalities. And in fact, the influence of your environment and the context and your culture, your socioeconomic status, isolation, all of those things actually do have a direct effect on the physiological systems in your body. And so rather than, diagnosing someone with depression based on a concentration of, proteins in their blood or the lack or presence of a certain genetic component, you would pull out and say you go from a more holistic perspective. And really, this call has been out there for a while. The biopsychosocial approach to medicine, they said it in 1997 or 1977 paper, and the pivotal mental states, as well as a framework in which we can hopefully understand the causality of these things, because essentially, I'm interested to get your opinion on this, but do you think it has changed at all? Do you think in the U.S. we actually do consider the psychosocial components of health and wellness, or is it primarily just it's just medicine, it's biology? It seems like.
Yeah, well, I mean, it seems like it depends who you talk to, because I think you do, and I think a lot of the other guys I interviewed for this podcast do. But it seems like maybe along lines of psychiatry and stuff, they don't consider it. And I mean, it makes sense because it's not like we have a predetermined outcome with, the genetics we're born with. You might be born with something that makes you more likely to become an alcoholic, but you might not necessarily be an alcoholic unless you have, trauma or these different stressors that they were talking about. But there's, people out there that'll say, well, drugs will cause the addiction and not other things, or cannabis will make you become paranoid rather than, if you're already an anxious person, maybe sometimes it'll make you more anxious, or just examples like
Yeah,
that.
yeah. The what you've learned to associate with it has been what you're supposed to be paranoid about, not that it actually causes the paranoia. And then what you
Yeah.
said about addiction too, especially related to opiates and opiate use, it's essentially saying, yeah, the person is weak rather than looking at the drug specifically, or just looking at the drug specifically, or and completely for like avoiding the fact that this person is completely isolated. They're not making very good money. They faced a lot of childhood adversity. All of those things contribute. And so, really, with the pivotal mental states, and I think the narrative that they were following in this paper was essentially trying to figure out how much influence to put on these various aspects and put them in a model where they're all considered at once, not by separate doctors at separate times, separate appointments for different reasons, to sort of bring them all together. And only when we have them together, we can sort of start teasing apart what's being contributed from genetics, if anything, what's being contributed from biology, if anything, what's being contributed from their social environment, and what's being contributed from the cultural scene as well. And so, I think the reason why I was so attracted to social neuroscience and the conversations I would have is like, it doesn't, okay, so the 5-HTA receptor is important. Serotonin signaling is certainly important, but it's not the only thing. And SSRI is not a magic bullet, like just adding more oil to a car that's going to get rid of, these states of distress or mental illnesses. And so, I think for that alone is one of the reasons why I was so attracted to this, is that the notion of increasing cortical plasticity to elevate associative learning and then lead to psychological transformation, if the stars are aligned and the context and the set and the setting and all of that is in the right place, people really have these profound moments where their life is forever changed after that.
Yeah, and when they talk about elevated cortical plasticity, what does that mean?
So the cerebral cortex is it's a thin outer layer on the outside of your brain, the cerebral cortex, and it within that like thin bark layer around your brain, there are several layers within that as well. Humans have the most sort of complex, interconnected, and active cortical neurons or cortical signaling networks of any animal. And so really, if you look at a mouse brain, like they have two layers, and then you get up to higher up the evolutionary tree, more layers are added on. And so if you're looking for the seat of consciousness or where that exists, it's in the cortex. When there's damage to the cortex, people have like personality changes, or they forget they can look at an elephant but can't tell you what the name of it actually is, or they can mistake a car for a boat or something like that, just because their sort of associations have been lost. And so what I like to think about as the cortex is essentially when you have like information come in from your eyeballs, it goes through your optic nerves, it hits the back of your occipital lobe. At the first processing area, black and white are differentiated, or straight lines versus diagonal lines, like very rudimentary elements of the scene that you're looking at. Where are the boundaries between the things in here? Then it gets passed up to the secondary processing areas. That's where things like color and sort of rudimentary meaning and association between these two things happen. And then it gets to the tertiary cortex, the most advanced and highest level. And at that point, we don't really know like specifically what's happening, like we do in the lower levels, but it's essentially, the experience of seeing something coming in your eyes and seeing something in front of you is because that the signals from that are hitting your brain and sort of dissipating across the entire surface as they move through the cortex. And so plasticity refers to the ability of the cortical networks to change, add, or remove connections. When you're born, you actually start out with like, exponentially more connections than human adults. And over time, they get pruned. And that's essentially representative of you learning. And so increasing plasticity allows you to sort of break set, train track paths that are always firing in your cortex, make new connections between things, divergent connections between things. And then once the plasticity mechanisms have started moving forward, it strengthens that connection. So a new connection is formed, and it really, it's probably several thousand new connections that are formed. And then they're strengthened by repeatedly sort of those pathways firing.
I was just reading Gabor Mate's book about addiction called The Realm of Hungry Ghosts, and he was talking about that, how it becomes pruned. So babies that have stressed mothers and are in stressful environments, the pruning happens in such a way that it kind of leads to behaviors that sort of lead to addiction.
We have very clear evidence at the genetic, molecular, and signaling levels that lack of maternal attention in mammals leads to changes in especially serotonin signaling, and signaling networks. And so I would say the only modification I would say is it's more likely that there's downregulation of, let's say, serotonin receptors rather than like pruning is naturally something that occurs. It would happen anyway. Just because let's say, for example, the idea of a car is like somewhere in your head and you could just point to it. The way the cortex is that where I store the information of what a car is and where you store the information for what a car is are not the same. Once we get up to those tertiary levels, things are changing. And if you change the inputs, so they've done studies where they essentially, rather than sending visual information through the optic nerve, they'll reroute the nerves from the ears to that place. And that part of the brain develops into what would essentially be where the ears were pointing to normally, right? So you're sort of built with a blank slate, and then you start like sort of building out the inside of all of those signaling networks. And so with this model and what I'm trying to lay out here is that cortical plasticity is one thing. That's sort of a signaling system level thing. The molecular changes that we've observed have been downregulations of serotonin receptors, which then can lead to downstream differences in the signaling and the signaling strength. This paper spent a lot of time talking, molecular, system, psychology, then social and behavioral. They were very much like making it clear that it was an integrative, multi-level model that they're trying to put out.
And I'll just read a quote about we place special focus on the serotonin system and its 2A receptor 5-HT2AR subtype in particular, which has been shown to be particularly implicated in biology, times, environment, interactions. So that's kind of relates to what we're talking about, I think, doesn't it?
Yeah. So they say that in these pivotal mental states, it doesn't necessarily, it's not about the outcome. It's not if it goes good and turns into an epiphany that leads you to stop smoking cigarettes. Or it doesn't matter if it goes bad and results in PTSD. The point being is it's the same mechanism and the same set of multi-level influences, no matter what. And the linchpin of that is these serotonin receptors, where serotonin is a particularly difficult neurotransmitter system to study, especially in humans when it comes to consciousness and cortical signaling networks, because there are so many different receptor subtypes. And these receptor subtypes, sometimes when they're activated, they'll lead to, say, less signaling. And sometimes when they're activated, they'll lead to more signaling. And so it's been difficult to really understand how that, which way the tracks are going to get switched to. But what it seems to be, and this is why they use the psychedelics as the example, is that sort of getting those receptors activated gets you to sort of like a baseline sort of ready position. Then being in the right context, in the right environment with the right information or presented in the right way that sort of determines which way it'll go and how effective it could be at either, in a therapeutic setting, basically. When we give people psychedelics, they bind to this serotonin receptor in particular, and people are very susceptible to thinking about things in a new way, or thinking about things in a way that they don't bring a bunch of baggage to the table before thinking about it, which is how we normally, go about our day and our life. We sort of have to do it that way. But when you take psychedelics, what's reported is essentially this loss of ego, as well as the sort of pre-assumptions that you have, or patterns or habits that you have when you approach things. And so you can sort of just start looking at things from the bottom up without any influence of yourself, and just sort of feel, very connected to a much larger thing. That is an example of reaching a pivotal mental state and then walking away with it being like, I'm gonna change X with my life. I'm gonna tell my wife I love her more. That's sort of because psychedelics so reliably induce that type of sort of insight. And it's really hard to actually describe. It's always been hard to describe in writing. It's sort of when you felt it, when you've been there, if you know. But the fact that the psychedelics, both psilocybin and DMT and LSD, which all hit this receptor, and this receptor's activation by them is critical to actually feeling the effects of it, then there must be something about there must be something that our brain can do to get to that without the psychedelics. But that's why the psychedelics are even part of this paper, is that we give them the drugs, and almost every time someone has this sort of change in their feelings between themselves and the surrounding world that they're in, or they think about something in a different light. And let's say I was addicted to opiates for the last 10 years, and maybe you're coming down on yourself because of that. You could just realize that there's no reason to be coming down on yourself for that. You're stronger because of it. You should feel strengthened by it. And then you walk away and you integrate that into your new sort of default mode network. And then that was what occurred at the pivotal mental state.
Psychedelic therapy is interesting to me because I mean between the time I was 18 and like 25, I did acid over like 50 times, and it was just kind of like a gamble if it was going to be a nice experience or not. Well, most of them were fun, but the first time I did it actually was like, and the guy was like, he gave me 2 hits, and then he put the rest into some orange juice, and I didn't know it was in there, and like I just started drinking the orange juice. Yeah, and it was not pleasant after about 10 hours, and that was the first time I did it. But the idea of set and setting and therapy, I think, is a really good idea, because I think as long as I just tell people that haven't done it before, but I mean, just don't have anything to do for the rest of the day, and preferably the next day, because then you'll get too caught up in thinking about that when you should just be following whatever your brain tells you to do. Listen to music, sit around, laugh, take a walk in the woods.
I can't stop laughing. But beyond that too, like, yes, it's good to reserve that next day, especially just sort of to get back to what is quote unquote reality and normal life, but to just integrate and think about what you saw. The physical effects may be over within 12 hours, but the other thing you need to have is a home base. And you need to be around people who and you're friends with, and preferably, if it's your first time, you're around somebody who's done it before, so they can then help. They can help you should that be needed. I agree with you 100% in that moving psychedelics into a therapeutic context, rather than what would just be a recreational sort of let's take it to have fun context, I think will certainly diminish the risk of people having what they would consider unpleasant trips. I think that bad trips sort of get a bad rap, I guess, because of popular culture. Me personally, never anything that I would consider bad. I don't even think but I've been with people who were not cool with sort of losing touch for a little bit. We got them back, and it does happen. I just think the likelihood of that happening at, Coachella versus at your psychiatrist's office is certainly different. In the therapeutic setting, you're going to get a known dose of a known compound. That's the other sort of wild card.
And that's what happened to me. It was the first time I had no idea what to expect. I smoked weed for a couple of years. The weed wasn't even that good back then. And it was fun for a while, and then I got afraid that, and the friends I was with were kind of friends. We'd been to a couple of concerts together and stuff, but they, I couldn't trust them yet. It was kind of there. I was full of anxiety. I mean, still am a little bit, but not as much. And it was just it was. I knew that at the time. I kind of knew what happened. I'm I went in over my head, and then I just decided to do it myself next time. I had one hit. I took a walk in the woods. And it was fun. I had a good time, and the rest of the times were all fine, and most of them were instructive or just fun, just giggling at my friends the whole time. But yeah, a therapeutic setting would just be interesting because they're gonna ask you questions about. I mean, you might have an intention, you do
have an intention. That's the biggest thing. You go into it with an intention that's different from I'm gonna get fucked up and have a good time.
Yeah.
And you're gonna get fucked up, and you're probably gonna have a good time, but you're gonna be in the doctor's office, so everything's all right.
Yeah. I gotta trust that doctor, though. I mean, be oh man, I want to take a walk. Before LSD was outlawed in the 1960s, I mean, even cannabis too. I mean, they were using it in therapeutic settings and trying to help people out of depression, and it seemed to have been working before before it got outlawed and the whole drug war kicked in.
MDMA was actually being used in couples therapy and psychiatric settings. And showing great promise and results. We're getting close to that too. There's MDMA studies, clinical trials getting pushed through that I think wrap up in 2021. So we're getting back there. But with the psychedelics, I mean, with LSD in particular, the studies that you're talking about are used in the therapeutic setting. Really, to my knowledge, was really more about whatever the CIA was doing and trying to understand if it was mind control or this, that, or the other. What is even happening to these people is what we were trying to figure out back then. And I don't know if LSD, it depends. It would depend what your goals are and what your intention is. But I don't think you need to go through a 12-hour sort of rocket fuel to the moon to use it in a therapeutic setting. You can do a smaller microdose, or maybe you're looking to break patterns of thought that are related to creativity and sort of productivity and business and that. Not necessarily trying to change a habit of yours or the relationship of you to the memory of your parents in your childhood. I think that could be done with psilocybin and MDMA. And there's other ones you could do that just don't, it doesn't involve 24 to 48 hours of reassessing your life. But then again, I mean, ibogaine and ayahuasca, they're a few hours, but it's not 12 hours. It's not as long as LSD.
Yeah, I would think mushrooms would be the good one to start with, because you feel relatively normal about 5 hours later. A little different, but it's not it's not an all-day thing. You could still go to church on Sunday, I think, if you wanted to, if you did it on Saturday night.
You haven't given up on that completely and gone elsewhere.
That would be an interesting thing to do, to see if super religious people remain religious. Maybe it deepens their faith. And
hard to say, and it is interesting. I mean, they compare the psychedelics to mystical or spiritual experiences all throughout this paper as the counterexample to the Ptsd. If we look at all of the psychedelic drugs, LSD, psilocybin, ibogaine, PCP, MDMA, tryptamine, aniline, the phenylalanines, of all them, DMT seems to continually, DMT and ayahuasca seem to uniquely or specifically lead people to believe in a higher power or think that they've touched or seen, even if
Yeah.
they're atheists going into it. Those two in particular, people come out of it, feeling, oh, there's something out there that's taking care of all of us. It's good to go. So why that happens with those two and not with LSD as frequently is an interesting question. But yeah, it makes me think about how we sort of frame the utility of religion and religious communities within the sort of human evolutionary history, which is, just to put it in perspective, all of the religions that are all the major religions in the world today are generally only about 2,000 years old. But religion sort of served a universal purpose of always sort of being like a supportive community that you feel connected to and that you feel validated by, and that gives you a outlet and a support group to sort of share how things are going and someone to lean on, right?
Yeah.
And what the authors of this paper, I think, would suggest is that the fact that religion or religious like spiritual mystical aspects of human society seem to be there from the very beginning and still there today is because that the behavior of having that community is actually inducing pivotal mental states in the individuals and allowing them to have good, like, positive wellness outcomes out from it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And it even talks about religious practice and I mean prayer. No matter how you do it, it's sort of like meditation. We have a lot of studies about how meditation helps, and I've meditated before, and I totally understand it. But even saying your rosary is kind of the same type of thing. It's really just calming your brain down. And yeah.
Giving you an outlet to express your concerns and your worries and your wishes out loud
Yeah.
in a positive sort of light. Like you're not looking at it in a negative way. You're going into it with the intent of asking for something that you need or thanking someone for being grateful for what you have.
Yeah.
If we did those same things every time we went up to the chalkboard to do math would be the same. It would essentially give you the same ability to transform your sort of psychology there. If the behaviors were the same, it's not unique to religion. It's unique to the behaviors that come along with the community. They describe us as being in a modern secular environment. And basically the idea of a secular psychology or a psychology that isn't based in religious tenets or religious teachings. And they're saying that as we've moved further away from that, we now sort of lack the unified vision, integrated support, and shared values that were once much more widespread.
Yeah.
And so they bring this up and they are characterizing it in a way that essentially says this contextual or constructual framework to understanding human behavior and human thought patterns, pivotal mental states, is, if we get this right, we can essentially go ahead then and create humanistic contexts to be supportive of positive transformation. And rather than sort of only dealing with the negative or the stuff that like a PTSD inducing type event, a psychological crises, right? So rather than have just a immediate suppressive intervention, is what they say, for these emergencies. So like you have a psychological crisis, maybe you attempted suicide, that's a crisis, you immediately go sort of get treated in an intervention way. But when you go there, are they going through the motions of what they think is right to just get through the hoops and hurdles, or are they actually providing a environment and a context and even medicine or therapeutics to help you get to a place where you can approach it in a positive way and reframe your thinking about that situation in a way that doesn't lead to sort of debilitating stress or anxiety.
When someone dies, there's a funeral ritual, and it's kind of like after I was out of the Catholic Church, my sister died, and I was like, but this is a good ritual to do, kind of to help everybody get through an emotional state.
Acknowledging the grieving and just going through it. I mean, I
Yeah,
think the Jewish religion has it best there, where it's like a couple days, it's like a week where everybody's together, and
yeah,
if you're doing math, it doesn't matter. If you're doing math all together to sort of be there for each other, then the positive outcomes will happen. Um, but think about losing a parent or something, and then being stuck in Antarctica with no one there, and like a 2 mile hike just to get your water every day, right? That's You lose your mom. On top of all of that, your outcomes could dramatically change.
yeah,
So yeah, certainly there's a lot of things to learn and to acknowledge and to borrow or keep going from the religions that are out there now. But you know, I recently came across that statistic about how I don't think Islamic is part of Christianity. Those are the two major religions, but they're only 2,000 years old. Humans are 4.5 million years old.
yeah,
Yet we give so much heed to what we think are like these conservative, stable, steadfast, important social institutions, and I'm not saying that they're not any of that,
yeah.
but they're relatively new, and they've only been around for like less than not even 5% of our time here on the planet.
Yeah, that's good to remember. And the way our societies are structured, where there's powerful people and there's even slavery is so new compared to we were pretty much egalitarian for I mean I think for 90 something percent of our existence.
That's why the biopsychosocial approach is so important, and it's why it's such a shame that we are still, I think, more or less Western medicine is based on interventions and therapeutics rather than treating the holistic person as they are. One of the reasons that motivated me to do the social neuroscience, to understand, like, take sociology or history of economic theory or political systems, stuff like that, is because I think it's very clear that, like, if you were to have grown up, we all can very readily admit that if you were born in 2020 versus like 1920, who you are as a person is pretty different, just
Yeah.
because of the different times.
Mm.
Where you're born, of course, is a huge predictor of sort of what's ahead of you and the opportunities that you have. But also, I would say the language you use. So, a symbolic language versus an alphanumeric language, a romantic language versus like a Sanskrit. That fundamentally sort of changes how you think and what your internal dialogue is,
Mm.
and the ways that you can express yourself. But also, I'd say the economic system that you're underneath, the political system that you're underneath, all of these things clearly are the context in which most of our time and behavior is occupied to have an effect on the physiology of our being. And so what you were pointing out with like agriculture being new and these major civilizations that were no longer nomadic because we have agriculture now,
Mm.
that is an enormous change in what we were used to, sort of tribal, smaller groups on the move, working together, not necessarily sort of hoarding as many resources, no matter what it
Yeah.
is, as possible. So, and not sharing that in a way, some way with the community. And there's no way that our brain could the social and the cultural for like influences or environment that we live on is now changing much faster than our brain can adapt to, in a certain extent.
Mm.
But when you have this cortical plasticity and the ability for these mental states to be reached, where you can fundamentally change, a core tenet or assumption of your mode of thought, that would be the only thing that sort of allows us to survive or function in such a massive sociological change or environmental change. If that makes sense. It's
Yeah.
humans are very well adapted for change, and
Yeah.
all of that has to do with cortical plasticity, the way that we associate and learn things, and then how we spin that into the narrative of who we are and what we stand for. And there are very little, you don't necessarily, you don't see those traits in the animal kingdom,
Yeah. Yeah.
just for humans.
I don't know how squirrels would deal with it if they suddenly all had phones or something.
Or like they wanted, they had to go vegan or something, like, no more nuts. Like, what? Squirrel's like, what, dude? That's my life. Nuts are my life for sure. But yeah, they don't have the cortical plasticity and the ability to rapidly sort of integrate information and make a life-changing decision about it.
Yeah.
It's interesting too. I was looking up a quote from Steve Jobs. I think Steve Jobs said LSD and having a child were the two biggest events, or like life-changing events in his life. The first time he did LSD, and then having his daughter. I think it might not have been his daughter too. He might have said getting married.
Yeah.
But there are very few things where universally people will talk about sort of a life-changing experience. And it can be without psychedelics in a sort of religious, mystical setting. But when you add psychedelics to the mix, you sort of seem more likely to reach that state. And so, it's interesting. I think it's interesting to me because a lot of times in the community, or the people that ask us questions, they want to know, like, well, what about the other receptors? What about serotonin receptors or dopamine receptors? And how does mitragynine and the other kratom alkaloids, how does it affect those other things? And we're just now sort of able to untangle how specific psychedelics and hallucinogenics are modulating this complex serotonergic system. Where only once we understand that will we be able to sort of then take that those interactions and those multi-level influences and apply them to different things. But we're getting there, and we're just getting there now especially because psychedelics were banned from research for so long, and it's difficult to get the old, I probably said this on the podcast, right? We can delete it if not, but it's difficult to get grant money from the National Institutes of Drug Abuse to say, I want to give LSD to humans so I can unlock the secrets of human consciousness.
Yeah. You have said that before, but it's worth repeating, definitely.
It is. I had to take this class that was called How the Irish Became White. And it was a bunch of sociological theories, and it sort of opened my eyes to the idea that, oh yeah, if you want to understand people, looking at x-rays or MRIs of their brain is not the only way to do that. It's only half the picture.
Was that a class or is that a book?
I think it's a class. Maybe it was
Marginalized
Marginalized Americans was the class, actually. Yeah.
Okay.
That was the first book we read.
But then cool. I gotta read that. Because I think about this kind of thing all the time.
It's a good one. I could recommend all sorts of good ones to you on that. There's a book called The Geography of Thought that talks about different results in sort of basic psychology and neuroscience experiments between Westerners and Easterners. Like, by and large, Western individuals will look at a fish tank, and then when asked to describe what they saw in the fish tank, will sort of say, well, there was one big yellow fish, and everybody seemed to be following or listening to the big yellow fish. He seems to be the king of the castle here. There were like three other smaller ones off to the side. They didn't really seem to be doing much. And there was a bubble, a treasure chest bubble in there. Same exact experiment. Eastern mindsets or Eastern individuals generally describe the entire tank in that, it was a blue tank that had several plants and other rocks features. And the fish sort of as a whole, they don't go for the individual. They're looking at the whole. And so that's The Geography of Thought is a book that sort of explores that idea. And that's where social neuroscience came from, was sort of there was a professor at the University of Chicago who was studying loneliness, and the strongest predictor of whether or not someone's going to die, doesn't matter what the cause is, but it's sort of dying of old age, is that they lost their spouse. As soon as your spouse dies, your chances of dying like within that year sort of skyrocket.
Yeah.
And so it was a very clear example of how the external social and cultural world that you live in affects your physiology. And loneliness, this sort of like social construct, actually manifests itself within your body. And I think all of this sort of just goes back to cortical plasticity. I mean, we are who we are because essentially we have these like experiential sort of traces that run across our brain and sort of just diffuse across everywhere and hold those experiences in your cognitive state long enough that you can not only like react to things coming at you, but you can stop and think about several things in your head at the same time to put things together to sort of solve a problem. Other species, you know, are problem solvers and can do this, but we're the only ones that sort of also come with buildings of books and records and videos of other human experience that gets passed down. So we not only get genetic information, we also get that social information. And if our brain didn't have the plasticity, the ability to sort of hold and sort of like wash those experiences over your cortex, you know, we wouldn't be, human species wouldn't be what it is. And because we have such a dense and crazy cortical plasticity, we have top-down control. Not a lot of animals can think themselves into cancer. Or there's a book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. You know, we can stress ourselves into physiological illnesses because we have top-down control. The flip side of that is, well, because we can do that and affect things negatively, we can also affect things positively. And that's what this pivotal mental state, saying that with this cortical plasticity that is very well demonstrated with psychedelics, we can change the context and the environment to change the associations between your sort of feelings and representations of things. And that can lead to profound psychological transformations in, you know, who you are and how you behave.
It's cause for optimism because I think you know, we need some positive pivotal mental states in our country or in the world right now. I mean, individually, you know, this kind of thing is studied more and more. It gets out there. It's only going to be positive and maybe move the human race up a level.
And you have control of it. You know, the way that you react to things that happen to you in the world, because shit's gonna happen. That's just what, you know, sort of going through life is. Those stressors, those things that sort of try to take you away from homeostasis are going to happen. But if you know that you can control your reaction to them in a way that would be better for you in the long run, it's just important to know that information and know that you have that power to change, you know, to change your fundamentally your relationship to the world and yourself and others. But it all sort of starts with, you know, positive mental attitude, which I think is the mantra in, you know, sort of rehab and physical therapy is, you know, positive mental attitude can really get you through at the end of the day.
Awesome.
The one other thing I just want to note real quick is that when we talk about the number of connections in the human cerebral cortex, we're talking about 100 trillion connections. And to my knowledge, there is nothing, it's the most complex and intricate and detailed like network connection thing that we have ever found anywhere. I mean, it's unsurpassed. I think we have more, you know, more connections than we do sort of galaxies in the sky. So, you know, why I got into neuroscience is sort of the remaining big questions, you know, what about space? What about the oceans? And what about the brain? So it's cool that psychedelics are now getting introduced in a academic and sort of scholarly way in order to probe how those connections make you who you are. And it wouldn't be possible really without the psychedelics.
I hope you enjoyed that topic as much as Dr. Cachat and I did. You can find Dr. Jonathan Cachat on @jcachat on Twitter and at ccvresearch.com. Follow us at Kratom Science on Twitter, kratomscience.com. The music is Captain Big Wheel. The song is called Moonrunner. Written and produced by me, Brian Gallagher, for kratomscience.com. Take care.